Broadcasting from Salisbury University campus, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7. Putting Delmarva first. Stay tuned for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
It's been 50 years this week since the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. On that April day in Memphis, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was at a local hotel, and as he emerged from his room, he was struck down by an assassin's bullet. Eventually, James Earl Ray was convicted of his murder, but King's death also set off a firestorm in cities across the country. So we want to take a look back at his death, his legacy, and where we are some 50 years later. We begin with Eddie Boyd. He's a retired professor at the University of Maryland, Eastern Shore. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Don.
So where were you when you heard the news that King had been killed?
I was in my senior year of undergrad school at Grambling State University, and I don't remember exactly what was going on that day, other than once I learned that he'd been killed, certainly the sort of sadness that overwhelmed me as well as most of the folk that I knew at that time.
So what was their reaction? What was the mood? Was it anger? Was it sadness? What?
Well, in
where you were?
In the area where I was, the mood was certainly sadness filled with a bit of anger, maybe more than a bit of anger, but how that anger was expressed. By the way, I was there in Louisiana. So the way that anger was expressed was certainly different there than some of the riots, in cities like Washington, D.C., and, of course, in Newark and places like that.
Well, because Louisiana was still emerging from Jim Crow, so you still have a white community out there. How do you balance your anger versus, obviously, this community out there which was certainly hostile to King and certainly has this legacy of Jim Crow, which still had not really been eliminated?
Right. That's why I would say the anger was tempered in many ways, and what we really experienced was a sense of loss, a sense of sadness, a sense of unbelief. Those are the emotions that I remember most. And of course, the idea of who did it, why. And even to this day, certainly I don't have a clear answer that I could say, well, I believe James Earl Ray acted alone. Certainly, with the many conspiracy theories out there, I'm not sure which one I believe in. Yeah. However, I am not so sure, though, that perhaps others other than James Earl Ray was involved. Even it's quite possible that even our own government might have been involved.
Was there a sense of betrayal?
A sense of betrayal?
Yeah, when you heard the news that King was struck down.
Well, right. I think, during that time, certainly when King was struck down, we were not, I would say, not all that surprised, because King had talked about in a number of his speeches, prior even before the mountaintop speech, but especially with the mountaintop speech. Of course, we heard that after he had been killed. However, he talked about the threats on his life and how often his life was threatened. And not only had King's life been threatened, but there were many examples of how brutal folk were. And so that it's amazing that maybe he lived as long as he did, being as outspoken as he was.
Did you, by the way, at that period of time, we had obviously the civil rights legislation that was passed, the voting rights legislation that was passed. The federal government seemed now to get certainly seriously behind civil rights. Was there a sense of optimism that things were changing as you approached that year of 1968? What was your sense? And you were young. You were a student.
Well, there was a sense that things were changing for sure. However, during that time, not only were we involved in the civil rights struggle, but I mean, we have to remember the war in Vietnam was certainly requiring a great deal of our attention, especially for those of us who were in school, maybe on deferments. But most of the people we knew, or many of the people I knew, were either deferred or actually preparing to serve in Vietnam or serve in the Army, being drafted or had volunteered. So consequently, there were these, I would call it maybe the push and pull. We had the battle for civil rights, but also we had this whole notion that at just any day you may go to war in Vietnam. And of course, King certainly had talked about how awful that war was in Vietnam, and why, what a troublesome time it was, and how the nation, our own nation, he actually said that we were criminals in that war. So those were the times. And add to that, you're about to graduate from college. Now, you're about to really enter into the real world. So there were a number of things going on in my life at that time, sort of growing up and really becoming somewhat at a point where I was about to embark upon, an entry into the real world where I had to really fend for myself.
King was criticized for his criticism of the Vietnam War, and many people saw this as a break with Lyndon Johnson, who had been a strong supporter of the civil rights movement, that perhaps this was not an area he should have been involved with. What do you make of that? There was criticism about that.
Well, I think that's right. Then many people felt that way. He had diverted his attention from the civil rights movement and was getting involved in this global politics in a way. However, and maybe then at that time in '68, I might have even felt that way myself, but once I really spent some time listening to some of Dr. King's sermons, reading some of his writings, then I understood why he had to take the stand against Vietnam that he did. And obviously he was right. And I think that's the most important piece for me, is the things that he said that we were doing. Indeed, we were, as a nation, committing those awful acts in Vietnam. And since we've also learned that how we were portrayed as a nation by the president, as well as those in Congress who, Westmoreland and others who were really, in the administration, who were leading this effort. And then often, a few years ago, we actually learned that some of the folk who were leading the efforts are now saying, well, yeah, we were saying this, but we really didn't believe this. We knew we were losing the war in this sort of thing, or we knew that, we really had lied essentially to the American people about why we were there. And that was one question that was really never answered, I would say, for the nation or for the soldiers who and the military who were actually fighting the war. When you really thought about it, why am I fighting this war? And there were never any clear answers to this day that I can understand, other than maybe it was a war that the president had inherited. He ended up actually spending a bit more time on it. And of course, I would say, somewhat ambivalent about what was happening himself. So therefore, it was a tough time.
Now, it seems to me that by 1968, the great focus, of course, had been on voting rights and civil rights and that sort of thing. And it seems within the African-American community that there was a certain sense that it wasn't enough. And you get this emergence of the Black Power movement, which seems to me a reaction to the fact that there just wasn't enough progress being made. I mean, you could order, for instance, the schools to be desegregated, but that didn't mean that that was going to be done right away. As a matter of fact, here on the Eastern Shore, they weren't until the late 1960s, actually, that occurred. What do you make of the Black Power movement in relationship to King and his message, which seemed a bit broader?
Well, Well, actually, I think we tend to try and separate those movements, but it was really one movement with a number of actors, is the way I kind of think about it now. Um, Certainly, the Black Power movement, including even prior to the Black Power movement as such, Malcolm had already spoken and had already been killed himself in '65. So there was some militancy already in the black community long before Stokely Carmichael, coined the phrase Black Power. Yes, there was progress being made, yes. It was slow, yes. But one of the things I think that I recall, and as I go back and look at Dr. King's writings and so on, he talked about the three crises in our nation, evils in our nation, and he had delineated them as racism, poverty, and war. He described those as the three evils in our nation, and we still have all three of those, by the way. We still are battling racism, not only in this country, but globally, racism is a problem today. I mean, I just listened yesterday with some activity going on in Hungary where, people are outwardly discussing why they don't want the blacks from Africa to come and live in Hungary. So racism is with us, and it's still an evil in our world. Poverty is with us, and that's where I think Dr. King really was beginning to focus toward just prior to his being killed, was that he wanted to address what he called the root cause of some of these things, which really was poverty. And of course, war, and how you have all three of these, and they're not really complementary activities; they are competing activities in many ways.
What do you think King would have made of America today, coming off certainly the first African American president, mm-hmm. and yet the current president being extremely racially divisive?
Well, certainly I don't think he would be all that surprised, because, like I said earlier, racism is still a part of the fabric of America. It's not as overt as it was when I grew up in Louisiana. But for whatever reason, there is this tendency to look at things through the racial lens for whatever reason, And as we learn today and we look at these new studies that come out, in the only way oftentimes many of the disparities can be explained, even with poverty, is when you drill down a little bit more, there's more than poverty. There's racism with poverty. As you might have seen a story recently on black children, how they're disciplined in school, and the disparity in discipline. And when they drill down, it's beyond poverty. It's something going on that's even outside of poverty. We find that black youngsters are still being disciplined a bit more severely than others within the schools. And I say a bit more, but it's a lot more. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just simply saying those are signs that racism is still with us.
We've been speaking with Eddie Boyd. He's a retired professor at University of Maryland, Eastern Shore. We appreciate you taking time to speak with us.
All right. Well, thank you. Appreciate your time.
We now turn to Charlotte King with the Southern Delaware Alliance for Racial Justice. Welcome to the program.
Good. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to be talking to you.
So on this week, the anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., I want to go back to when you first heard about the assassination. Where were you? What was your reaction? What was the sense at that moment in time?
I believe I was working in Washington, D.C., and in the midst of the riots that were about to begin. And of course, like many Americans, both white and black, I had a tremendous sense of anger. Greater than the fear was the anger that, like Sisyphus, you climb that mountain, you almost get there, and then you slide right back down. And I saw his assassination as us sliding back down the mountain. When I say us, I mean all Americans. Because as Martin Luther King said, injustice for one is an injustice for all of us. We all suffer.
And what was the reaction of the people around you? Basically the same as well?
I think it was pretty much because I was centered in a high-profile neighborhood in D.C. I was working for D.C. government at that point, social services. So there was lots of anger.
So what? Yeah.
And it's that hopelessness, it's that anger that comes from hopelessness, which then causes people to act out. I often said that the riots are the voice of the oppressed. If you have no other way to express yourself, then like a child, you throw your bottle out of the crib.
So what was that like then, and moving around the city at that moment in time?
I was very cautious about moving around the city because when violence goes unchecked, and there were the riots in D.C., everyone's a target. And so I'm not the world's best hero. I tend to be cowardly in the face of potential danger. But I understood. I understood why. People were angry. But part of my confusion and anger was, besides being angry at who did this, was I wish people would understand that further violence will set us back even more. I always thought, isn't it ironic that when people are rioting, they destroy their own environment, which is a bad enough environment anyway. And they're doing just what their oppressors want them to do. Make life even harder for themselves. So then the oppressor can say, see?
Was there a sense, by the way, at that moment that we were talking about making progress? We had the civil rights legislation, the voting rights legislation. Was there a sense of optimism before this occurred? I mean, we did have some rights. I think it was in certainly Watts in '65. But was there an optimism that something may be just about around the corner and then this kind of thing happens?
The ordinary citizen, most people, including myself, aren't aware that there have been major legislative changes. I mean, it's not something that you hear about every moment of the day unless you read the paper, listen to the radio, have a favorite TV channel, read commentaries. What do you know about what's happening? If you ask somebody today, what's the major piece of legislation right now in Congress, how many would know? If you ask people today, is there a bipartisan movement towards criminal justice reform, how many people would know? I mean, people just aren't that aware of their political environment or their civic environment. Their, daily struggle is enough to keep people busy. Plus, again, in terms of my work environment, I was in a neighborhood where survival was the priority. There was always a welfare line outside of my agency. And around the corner there was the homeless, and down the street, there were the drug dealers. They didn't take time out from their agenda to find out what's going on in Congress. Now, amongst my friends, none of us were politically active at that point. And I say politically active, all of us were aware, but none of us were drop everything you're doing and go march in the streets kind of folks. Today I am. That's the irony. Today at age 80, I've become this activist. And I apologize to the universe for waiting so late.
Right after the assassination and these events, how long did it take you to become an activist? Were you spurred by these events?
No, what I did become was someone who was determined to stay more aware of what was happening. But I didn't become an actual activist until, I mean, I went to every march. Back in those days, I went to every march in Washington. I read up on anything that was really happening because the pattern of assassinating or eliminating good men, the Kennedys, Martin Luther King, and many others, several others, I thought that pattern needed to be followed to see where was it leading. So in my mind, yes, I was certainly more attuned and more alert. But in terms of forming something like the Southern Delaware Alliance for Racial Justice, I didn't do that until 3 years ago, because then I was a retired person. I must say, back in the day, I was overconsumed with my job. I was an obsessive employee.
I can relate to that.
So who had time? And I was raising a child, and I was commuting. Foreign concept down here in Delaware. You say commute, people think you're talking one block. I lived in Annapolis, Maryland, was commuting to D.C. So there was little time in between.
By the way, what agency did you work for?
I'm trying to think what we call it, Department of Human Services. It was the Public Welfare, Child Welfare, Family Service Agency, the one that the agency that provided all of the services within D.C.
So you saw what was going on really on the ground floor in terms of what was happening to individual people, as opposed to, say, people who are sitting back watching all of this stuff on TV.
Right. I mean, I was surrounded by poverty. I was surrounded by the homeless, and I won't say they were just necessarily D.C. homeless people. They were homeless people from D.C. or who drifted into D.C. Before I went to Washington, I had worked in Charles County, Maryland, and I worked in social service then, and we used to encourage our homeless to get into D.C., where there'd be better services than there was in rural Charles County, Maryland. But the homelessness was just the most pervasive sign in Washington at that point.
Let me ask you this. So in terms of Martin Luther King and his legacy, it seems that we have almost two, at least in the immediate aftermath, two movements. One is obviously things like the SCLC and the Civil Rights Movement, and then you also had the rise of the Black Power movement as well. How do you assess those legacies from that era?
Well, the rise of the Black Power movement actually may have been contrary to, at least in their philosophy, to what Martin Luther King or Dr. King was advocating for. When Dr. King died, various black leaders, those in the Black Power movement, certainly were not for a nonviolent, peaceful approach to racial justice. And part of me could understand why. It's certainly a longer process to wait for people to turn around and grant people equality. But I'm not sure what he would. Well, I know what he would say about a movement that advocated force, that advocated aggressive civil disobedience, that advocated pushing back harder. I mean, over the years, I have looked at his writings, and I thought he is like every great philosopher king. He preached the use of justice and love. And nonviolence, capacities we as a species are not accustomed to. And that would have been a very long-term process. The impatience in the Black Power movement and the need for an immediate change meant the action had to be more visceral.
What do you think he would have thought of the United States today, its condition, coming after, obviously, yeah?
He'd be so depressed. Well, there were moments of hope. I think the election of Barack Obama. And I don't say that as a black person or as a party person. I have no party affiliation because parties blind you. But he would have been very hopeful about that election. Was he the perfect president? No, there is no such thing. But he was a sign of hope, a good sign of hope. If he looked at America today, he would weep. He would weep like I weep every morning when I turn on that television and see that incompetent criminal making the racial divide, making the inevitable destruction of our democracy deeper and deeper. On the other hand, if he looked closer, last night the Alliance gave a brief half-hour ceremony just to commemorate his death. And I looked around the room, and it was such a mixture, such a diverse mixture of, your ordinary citizen who works at McDonald's and your retired ambassador to Pakistan coming together to reflect on the death of Martin Luther King, coming together to make a commitment to keep trying to realize his dream for everyone. But that's a long-term process, unfortunately. And I'm not one of those people who wants to buy into, well, just be patient, Charlotte. I'm 80. What does patience mean? I'll be dead in 5 years. The hope is in what we saw 2 weeks ago, that very young generation. Let us just pray that, unlike other teenagers, they can stay on track. That is the only hope.
Do you think that we're just simply passing perhaps through a period of time in American history, that the movement that King started, this shift, this change in America, that it'll get beyond this moment in time politically?
I think we always get beyond it in a moment in time. With each change where you fall back and then you come back, you gain a little bit more. I think we see those gains. One can't deny that there are gains, even in terms of, as I look at those people last night, there were more people at the table. There are more people willing to change the public narrative. But we must be consistent and determined that we will continue to push forward to bring other people to the table, the ones who are the most resistant.
How do you do that?
I think you do it through education. That's why that's the mission of the Alliance. People are uninformed. At any age in America, people are, except those who assertively go out and become informed. You've got to inform. You've got to educate. You've got to do together. You've got to have those public conversations. You've got to sit down with people you're normally uncomfortable with and talk together. You've got to learn the true meaning, and again, this gets very philosophical, and most of us are more practical than philosophical. You've got to get the true meaning of what did he mean, what did his words mean? They're more than just pretty words. What do they mean? What is his concept of unconditional love? What is his concept of the beloved community? What does equality really mean? Does it mean you give me a pat on the head and that's the end of it? I mean, there's just so much to learn. And I know even at my old age, in the past 3 years, I learned about my own bigotry. Because we do all have implicit biases. And we're all reluctant to give up those implicit biases, except for the very young. That's why I sometimes think, let's forget everyone over the age of 50. Let's focus all of our energy on those young people who don't see differences until you hammer away at them and say they're different. They're bad. Hate is really taught. It is really something people have been taught. That's why sometimes I'm very forgiving of the racists when I come across them, because I thought, that's what they learned. That's what generations of relatives have taught them. They did not voluntarily become this ignorant and stupid.
So you're hopeful.
Have a little patience, Charlotte. Have a little sympathy.
We've been speaking with Charlotte King. She's with the Southern Delaware Alliance for Racial Justice. Appreciate you taking the time to talk with us this morning.
Glad you called.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for watching Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Production and audio engineering by Chris Frank. Hosted by Don Rush. For podcasts, visit delmarvapublicradio.net or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast on iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on Pack 14.